Welcome back to Gotham Trends, everyone. Today, we're diving into a subject that's deeply unsettling, the mind of a terrorist. We're going to try to understand what leads someone to commit such horrific acts.
It's a difficult conversation, but a necessary one, if we want to prevent future tragedies.
Exactly. And we're going to focus on two recent attacks here in the U.S., the truck attack on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, and the Cybertruck explosion outside the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas.
Both incidents shook the nation, and they really highlight the range of motivations and methods we see in modern terrorism.
You know, when we hear about these attacks, it's easy to just label the perpetrators as evil and move on. But I think it's crucial to dig deeper, to try to understand the psychological factors that might be at play. What can you tell us about the common threads that researchers have found?
Well, one thing that often comes up is the idea of an identity crisis. This isn't about forgetting your name, but a deeper sense of feeling lost, disconnected from society, and struggling to find your place in the world. It's like you're adrift, searching for something to hold on to.
So would you say that these individuals are more susceptible to extremist ideologies because they're looking for that anchor, that sense of belonging?
Absolutely. Extremist groups offer a very rigid, clearly defined identity and set of beliefs. It can be incredibly appealing to someone who feels lost and directionless. They're offered a ready-made community, a purpose, and a sense of belonging that they may have been craving.
But wouldn't you say that belonging is a bit of a contradiction when it comes to terrorist groups? I mean, often their actions isolate members further, demanding they commit acts that separate them from mainstream society. How do they reconcile that?
That's a fascinating point, and you're right, there's a definite tension there. But it's important to remember that these groups are masters of manipulation. They exploit people's needs, often twisting their desire for belonging into a sense of us versus them. They convince recruits that they are the chosen few, the righteous ones, fighting against a corrupt and evil world.
It's a chilling thought. But it makes me wonder about the role of copycat attacks. Do these high-profile acts of violence, like the ones we're discussing, inspire others who are struggling with similar feelings of alienation?
There's definitely a risk of that. Seeing someone, even a stranger, act on those feelings. Achieving a certain level of notoriety can be a dangerous validation. For someone who's already teetering on the edge,
It's almost like the ideology provides a framework to justify their actions, a way to make sense of the chaos and pain they might be feeling internally.
you're getting at another key factor here: cognitive dissonance. This is the mental discomfort we experience when our beliefs clash with reality. Imagine someone who feels deeply wronged by society, but their attempts to change things have failed. That creates a powerful dissonance.
So could you say that extremist ideologies offer a way to resolve that discomfort? I mean, they provide a simplified black and white worldview, where violence is justified as a means to an end.
Precisely. It eliminates the dissonance by offering a clear enemy, a righteous cause, and a path to redemption, even if that path is paved with violence.
And what about the role of social isolation? I imagine that amplifies these feelings of alienation and makes individuals even more vulnerable to extremist messages.
Absolutely. Loneliness can be a powerful driver. When someone feels isolated and lacks a support network, those extremist messages become much more potent. And with the rise of social media, it's easier than ever for these groups to connect with vulnerable individuals.
Right. The internet can be a double-edged sword in that way. It can be a source of information and connection, but it can also be a breeding ground for extremism,
Yeah,
especially with the rise of these echo chambers.
exactly. These echo chambers fueled by algorithms that prioritize engagement trap people in a cycle of confirmation bias. They're constantly bombarded with content that reinforces their existing beliefs, no matter how extreme or unfounded those beliefs might be. And this makes it incredibly difficult to break free from that mindset.
And then you have the sense of injustice, the feeling of being wronged by the world. It seems like a lot of terrorists see themselves as victims, striking back against a system they see as unfair. How does that factor in?
Yeah, it's a potent motivator. These individuals may feel marginalized, discriminated against, or powerless to change their circumstances. Through conventional means, that perceived injustice festers and can fuel a desire for retaliation, for revenge. And extremist groups offer a channel for that rage, a way to strike back at the perceived oppressor.
So, in a way, these groups are preying on people who are already hurting, offering them a distorted sense of purpose and belonging. while manipulating their pain and anger for their own agenda.
That's a very insightful observation. And unfortunately, this toxic cocktail of psychological vulnerability and carefully crafted propaganda has led to devastating consequences, as we saw in the New Orleans attack.
Right, let's talk about Shamsuddin Jabbar, the man who carried out that horrific attack on Bourbon Street. His case seems to highlight the complex interplay of personal struggles and extremist ideology that we've been discussing.
It certainly does. Jabbar's story is a tragic example of how someone can become susceptible to extremism, especially when grappling with trauma and a lack of support.
So let's unpack his story a bit. What do we know about his background?
Jabbar was a 42-year-old U.S. Army veteran. He had a history of PTSD and untreated trauma, likely stemming from his time in service.
So even after returning home, the battlefield stayed with him in a way.
Sadly, yes. And that's a reality for far too many veterans. They struggle to reintegrate into civilian life, carrying the invisible wounds of war. And that sense of displacement, of not belonging, can make them incredibly vulnerable to extremist recruitment.
I imagine that feeling of isolation must be incredibly difficult to cope with, especially when you're also dealing with the trauma of war.
Absolutely. And in Jabbar's case, he tragically found solace in the twisted ideology of ISIS, pledging allegiance to the group before carrying out the attack.
And this was the group that inspired his attack on Bourbon Street, right? The one where he drove a rented pickup truck into a crowd, killing 14 people and injuring 35 others.
Yes, that's right. It was a horrifying act of violence that shook the city and the nation.
And it's a chilling reminder of how accessible and deadly vehicles can be as weapons in these types of attacks. They require no special training, and the potential for mass casualties is terrifying. It makes you wonder, could this happen anywhere?
That's a very real concern, unfortunately. And that accessibility is precisely what makes this tactic so appealing to lone wolf terrorists. It lowers the barrier to entry, so to speak, and allows individuals to inflict significant damage with relatively little planning or expertise.
What can we learn from Jabbar's case, specifically about the impact of military trauma and the exploitation of veterans by extremist groups?
Well, for me, it underscores the urgent need for better mental health care for veterans. Many return home bearing invisible wounds without adequate support. They can become susceptible to extremist narratives that offer a twisted sense of purpose and belonging.
It's like they're being re-traumatized, but this time by the very system that was supposed to support them, a system that maybe failed to recognize their pain or provide the help they needed.
That's a heartbreaking way to put it, but it's sadly true in many cases. And it speaks to a broader societal failure to adequately address the needs of those who have served our country. We owe it to our veterans to do better, to provide them with the care and support they deserve.
Absolutely. We need to recognize the signs of trauma, offer accessible mental health resources, and create a culture where seeking help is seen as a strength, not a weakness.
I couldn't agree more.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the Las Vegas attack and Matthew Livelsberger, his case driving a Tesla Cybertruck packed with explosives into the Trump International Hotel. Seems quite different from Jabbar's, wouldn't you say?
Yes, there are distinct contrasts, particularly in the choice of target, the method of the attack, and the apparent motivations. It raises a lot of questions about the different paths to extremism.
This idea of seeking recognition, making a statement, it really jumps out in Livelsberger's case, especially with his choice of target and that Cybertruck. What are your thoughts on that? Why choose such a high-profile location and a vehicle associated with innovation and power?
It's an intriguing question. Perhaps Livelsberger was driven by a desire for notoriety, a need to make a statement that would reverberate on a larger scale. The symbolism of the Cybertruck itself is also interesting.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the Cybertruck is often seen as a symbol of disruption, a challenge to the status quo. His choice of vehicle could reflect a desire to lash out against perceived societal norms or power structures.
So it's more than just a vehicle. It becomes a symbol of rebellion, a way to send a message.
Precisely. And that message, however misguided, is amplified by the target itself. The Trump International Hotel. It's a building that represents wealth, power, and a certain set of values that Livelsberger may have rejected or felt alienated from.
We also know that Livelsberger was an active-duty U.S. Army soldier in his early 30s, with reported depressive tendencies and a fascination with explosives. Could untreated mental health issues have played a role in his actions?
It's certainly a possibility that we can't ignore. Depression, especially when coupled with access to, and fascination with explosives, creates a dangerous mix.
And let's not forget that he ended his life before the explosion. That suggests a level of despair and internal conflict that's difficult to comprehend.
It does indeed. It's as though his actions were a cry for help, albeit a tragically destructive one.
It's a reminder that mental health issues can affect anyone, even those who appear to be functioning well on the surface. And that's why it's so crucial to create environments where people feel comfortable seeking help without stigma.
I wholeheartedly agree. We need to encourage open conversations about mental health and make sure that resources are readily available for those who are struggling.
We'll continue our deep dive into the mind of a terrorist in just a moment, exploring the motivations of lone wolf attackers and the role of social media and technology in all of this. Stay with us.
Welcome back to Gotham Trends.
We've been examining the complex psychology behind terrorism, looking at 2 recent attacks in the U.S. as case studies.
It's been a heavy but important conversation, hasn't it? Trying to understand the factors that can lead someone down such a destructive path is never easy.
It isn't. And as we delve deeper into the motivations of lone wolf terrorists, like Jabbar and Livelsberger, we find a diverse range of factors at play.
It's rarely a simple equation.
So it's not just about ideology. There's more to it than just subscribing to a particular set of beliefs.
Exactly. While extremist beliefs certainly provide a framework for justifying violence, there are often more personal and deeply rooted motivations driving these individuals. Think of it like this. You might have the same blueprint for a house, but the people living inside and what they do within its walls can be very different.
That's a great analogy. So what are some of the other drivers we see in these cases? What makes someone vulnerable to this kind of thinking?
Well, one common driver is a sense of personal grievance. These individuals often feel deeply wronged by society, the government, or specific individuals. They may perceive themselves as victims of injustice, discrimination, or some form of systemic oppression.
So they're lashing out at a world they feel has wronged them, almost like a twisted sense of revenge.
In a way, yes. They're seeking retribution, a way to strike back at a system they believe is fundamentally unfair. They might feel unheard, ignored, or powerless to change things through conventional means.
And that thirst for revenge can be incredibly powerful, can't it? It can cloud judgment and distort one's perception of reality.
Absolutely. It can lead to acts of violence that are both horrific and deeply misguided. Imagine carrying that weight of perceived injustice and then being offered a way to right it, even if it means causing harm to others. It's a slippery slope.
You also mentioned a desire for recognition as a motivating factor. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Certainly. For some lone wolf terrorists, it's not just about striking back, it's about making a statement. They crave attention, notoriety, and a lasting legacy. They want to be remembered, even if it's for a horrific act. It's like they're thinking, if I can't make a positive impact on the world, then I'll make a negative one that everyone will remember.
And that desire for recognition often plays out in their choice of targets and methods, right? They want to maximize the impact of their actions and ensure that their message is heard loud and clear.
Precisely. They may target high-profile locations or symbols of power to amplify the shock value and ensure widespread media coverage. Think back to Livelsberger's choice of the Trump International Hotel. He wasn't just targeting a building. He was targeting a symbol of wealth, power, and a particular ideology that he may have vehemently opposed.
Right, and the Cybertruck itself becomes part of that message, a symbol of rebellion and disruption, as you mentioned earlier. It's a fascinating and disturbing example of how terrorists are incorporating elements of popular culture and technology into their acts.
Absolutely. And it speaks to a broader point about the changing landscape of terrorism. It's not just about traditional hierarchies and organized groups anymore. Technology has made it easier for individuals to radicalize themselves, connect with like-minded individuals online, and plan attacks without ever having to meet face-to-face.
Which brings us to the role of extremist ideologies themselves. You've talked about how they offer a sense of belonging and purpose. But what else makes them so appealing to these individuals? What is it about these ideologies that resonates with someone who's feeling lost and angry?
Well, one thing is that extremist ideologies often provide a simplistic, black and white view of the world. They offer easy answers to complex questions, a sense of certainty in a world that can feel chaotic and overwhelming. Imagine you're struggling to make sense of your life, of the world around you. Then someone comes along and says, here's a problem, here's the enemy, and here's what you need to do to fix it. It can be very seductive, especially for someone who's already feeling vulnerable and desperate for answers.
It's like they're being handed a ready-made script for their lives. All they have to do is follow the instructions, no matter how extreme or dangerous those instructions might be.
That's a powerful way to put it. These ideologies offer a sense of structure, meaning, and direction. They tell you who your enemies are, what your purpose is, and how you can achieve it. And for someone who's feeling lost and directionless, that can be incredibly seductive, even if it ultimately leads them down a path of destruction.
And we've also talked about the role of untreated mental health issues,
Listen.
like PTSD and depression, in contributing to radicalization. Can you expand on that a bit more? Is there a direct link between mental illness and terrorism?
It's important to be clear that mental illness doesn't directly cause terrorism. However, it can create a profound sense of vulnerability and despair. It can distort one's perceptions of the world, making it difficult to cope with stress, trauma, and feelings of isolation. Imagine feeling trapped in your own mind, constantly battling with negative thoughts and emotions. That vulnerability can be exploited by extremist groups who prey on those who are struggling and offer them a distorted sense of hope and purpose.
So it's not about saying that everyone with mental health challenges is a potential terrorist, but rather that these challenges can make individuals more susceptible to extremist influences.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the signs of vulnerability and offering support before someone falls prey to these dangerous ideologies. And this goes back to what we were discussing earlier about the need for better mental health care, especially for veterans and others who have experienced trauma.
Absolutely. We need to make it easier for people to seek help, to talk about their struggles, and to find healthy coping mechanisms that don't involve violence or hatred.
I couldn't agree more. We need to create a culture where mental health is treated with the same importance as physical health.
Now let's talk about the role of social media and technology in all of this. It seems like these platforms have become both a breeding ground for extremism and a powerful tool for recruitment. How do you see this playing out in the cases we've been discussing?
Social media has fundamentally changed the landscape of radicalization. It's made it easier than ever for extremist groups to spread their message, connect with potential recruits, and create online communities that reinforce their ideology. And this is where those echo chambers we talked about earlier become really dangerous.
Can you explain how those echo chambers contribute to the process of radicalization?
Of course. Imagine you're scrolling through your social media feed. The algorithms are designed to show you content that you're likely to engage with, content that aligns with your existing beliefs and interests. Now imagine that you're struggling with some of the issues we've been discussing, feelings of alienation, anger, a sense of injustice. You start liking and sharing posts that reflect those feelings, and the algorithm takes note. It starts showing you more and more content that reinforces those beliefs, pushing you further down that rabbit hole.
So you're essentially being surrounded by information that confirms your existing biases, even if those biases are based on misinformation or distorted views of reality. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it?
Exactly, and that's what makes these echo chambers so dangerous. They create a feedback loop that can be incredibly difficult to break free from. You're constantly being exposed to messages that validate your anger, your grievances, and your sense of alienation. And over time, those extremist views can become more and more entrenched.
It's like a virtual breeding ground for extremism, where people can find community and validation for their most dangerous thoughts and impulses. And the scary part is that it's all happening right under our noses, often hidden in plain sight.
That's a very apt description, and it underscores the need for greater awareness and collaboration between governments, tech companies, and communities to combat the spread of extremism online.
So what can be done? Are there any effective strategies for prevention? How do we protect people from falling into these online traps?
There are, but they require a multifaceted approach. One crucial step is providing better mental health care for veterans and active duty soldiers, as we've discussed. But we also need to look at ways to strengthen community ties, promote critical thinking skills, and counter extremist propaganda online.
So it's about addressing the root causes of vulnerability, while also disrupting the channels through which these dangerous ideologies are spreading.
Precisely. It's a complex challenge, but one that we can't afford to ignore.
We'll continue our deep dive into the mind of a terrorist after a quick break. We'll be back to discuss potential prevention strategies and what we can all do to combat the spread of extremism. Stay with us. Welcome back to Gotham Trends. You've been having a tough but crucial conversation about the mind of a terrorist, using the recent attacks in New Orleans and Las Vegas as tragic examples.
It's been heavy, yes, but I think it's helped us understand that the path to terrorism is complex and rarely straightforward. There's a convergence of personal struggles, psychological vulnerabilities, and exposure to extremist ideologies that we need to be aware of.
Absolutely, and as we've discussed, there's no single profile of a terrorist. These individuals come from all walks of life, all backgrounds, and all belief systems. It's a reminder that this can happen anywhere to anyone, which makes prevention all the more important.
Precisely, and that's why our focus should be on prevention strategies. We need to identify those who might be at risk and intervene before they reach a point of no return. Think of it like this. We don't just wait for a building to catch fire before installing smoke detectors, do we?
That's a great point. So where do we start? You've talked about the need for better mental health care for veterans, for example. Can you expand on that a bit more?
Well, imagine you've served your country, experienced the trauma of war, and then return home feeling lost and disconnected. It's no surprise that many veterans struggle to reintegrate into civilian life, carrying the invisible wounds of PTSD, anxiety, and depression. We need to make sure they have access to quality mental health care that's tailored to their specific needs.
It's about recognizing that mental health is just as important as physical health, especially for those who have served our country and sacrificed so much. But it's not just about providing therapy, is it? There's a cultural aspect as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. We need to create a culture where seeking help is seen as a sign of strength, not weakness. Too often, there's a stigma attached to mental health issues, especially within the military. We need to break down those barriers and encourage open conversations about mental well-being.
I imagine it also involves training people to recognize the warning signs.
Yeah,
Friends, family members, colleagues. They might be the first to notice that something is wrong.
exactly. Early intervention is key. If we can equip people with the tools to identify those who might be struggling and encourage them to seek help, we can potentially prevent tragedies down the line.
And what about the role of communities in preventing radicalization? We've touched on this a bit, but I think it's worth exploring further. What can we do to create environments where people feel connected,
Mm.
supported, and less susceptible to extremist ideologies?
Strong community ties are absolutely essential. When people feel like they belong, like they have a purpose and a network of support, they're less likely to seek those things in dangerous places.
So it's about fostering a sense of belonging, but in a healthy and positive way. It's about creating spaces where people can connect with others who share their values,
Yeah.
their interests, their passions, without resorting to violence or hatred.
Exact. Think about your own life, your own community. What are the things that bring people together? It could be anything from volunteering at a local charity, to joining a sports team, to attending religious services. The key is to create opportunities for people to interact with each other, to build relationships, and to develop a sense of shared purpose.
And what about the online world? We've talked about how social media can be a breeding ground for extremism, with echo chambers reinforcing dangerous ideologies. What can be done to address that? It seems like an almost impossible task.
It's certainly a daunting challenge, but I don't think it's impossible. Tech companies have a responsibility to develop strategies for curbing the spread of hate speech and extremist content on their platforms. This involves things like improving algorithms to prevent the creation of echo chambers, flagging and removing dangerous content, and working with law enforcement to identify and track extremist activity online.
It sounds like a massive undertaking. But I guess the alternative is simply unacceptable. We can't just sit back and let these platforms become breeding grounds for hatred and violence.
Absolutely not. And it's not just about what tech companies can do. We as individuals also have a responsibility to be more discerning about the information we consume and share online. We need to be critical thinkers, to question sources, to challenge biases, and to resist the allure of simplistic answers to complex problems.
It's about being responsible digital citizens.
Right.
Understanding that our online actions have real-world consequences.
Precisely. And it's about educating others, especially young people, about the dangers of online radicalization. We need to teach them how to navigate the digital landscape safely, how to spot fake news and propaganda, and how to engage in respectful dialogue with those who hold different views.
It sounds like we all have a role to play in this fight, from individuals to communities to governments to tech companies.
We absolutely do. The fight against terrorism is a collective effort. It's about addressing the root causes of vulnerability, disrupting the channels through which these dangerous ideologies spread, and promoting a culture of empathy, understanding, and respect.
Well said. It's been a sobering conversation, but a necessary one. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the mind of a terrorist.
We have. And I hope it's given our listeners a better understanding of the complex factors that contribute to radicalization, as well as the importance of prevention and early intervention.
I hope so, too. This is a conversation that needs to continue. We can't afford to turn away from these difficult topics. Understanding the roots of extremism is the first step towards preventing future tragedies.
I couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power. And in this case, it could be the key to saving lives.
Thank you for joining us for this important conversation on Gotham Trends. We hope you'll continue to listen and engage with us as we explore the complexities of our world. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Gotham Trends for more thought-provoking deep dives.